Well, hello there, friends. Andrew with the bangs here. And today we continue my journey of grasping to understand the world in which I live, to understand the current cultural moment, to understand what is it that we hold dear in this life, in understanding what is meaningful to us. And naturally, as all wise folk before me have done, I look to the past to understand our present time. I am joined in this conversation with German philologist who was kind enough to come on my show a second time, Richard Rohlin. He is so flipping knowledgeable about so many things. I started off planning to speak to him about Tolkien, but right away it needed to be Dante. It just needed to be Dante because he sent me an article about it, about Dante's Divine Comedy. And without telling him, I kind of switched the topics like right away, right off the bat, and he was okay with it, which is awesome because he's just that smart that he was like, yeah, I could totally do a talk on the fly about the whole of Dante's work. So we only got from the Inferno into Purgatorio. We weren't holy enough for Paradiso, his words. But I think you guys will enjoy this discussion. I very much liked it. And the reason why I liked it is because we didn't end where I thought we would. And that's not because we didn't cover Paradiso. It's the answers I was looking for weren't exactly the answers that Richard gave me. And I kind of like being a little bit surprised. And yeah, so I am looking forward to hearing what you guys think. Please give me a like, write me any comments or questions that you might have. And if you are new, please do not forget to subscribe. Also, if you're listening to this in podcast form, I would really appreciate it if you would give me a 5-star rating and then, leave a little positive review because I am just terrible at asking for the podcast side of things. So yeah, if you would do that, that would be wonderful. Anyway, I'm going on way too long. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this chat. Hi, Richard. It's been 3 months since we've spoken.
Hey, Andrea.
To give a reference, I forgot to tell Richard that I was recording. So now we're officially starting. So I don't know if I'll put in.
I didn't have my thinking cap on. I thought we were just chatting, and so well, I
now
was
it's
trying to
on.
sound
Yeah.
Smarter for the recordings, obviously. So.
Well, I mean, honestly, though, Richard, it was me talking at you, so it's fine. It's better. This is good for me because I was doing a lot of ums and where should I start? So this is good for me to restart. So this happened with me with my talk with David Fuller, and I actually think it did go better the second time around. So I am perfectly fine to do that. So, okay. I was thinking that we could talk Tolkien, but it just ended up working better to talk Dante, as that happens so very often. Don't you hate it when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a short list of things that I can talk about at the drop of a hat. Tolkien is one of them. Dante is certainly another. So
great.
So I'm very comfortable with that pivot.
Okay, good. Yeah, I know. I kind of pivoted without letting you know. But you did send me the article. So it's because of the article you sent me. And it's talking about how Dante's model, the coming to the end of the medieval model, is starting to break down. And he's dealing with this in working out these things in his Divine Comedy. And I thought that sort of mapped on well to us in our modern model breaking down. And so I couldn't help it. I'm like, I want to do Tolkien, and we will get to Tolkien someday. I swear it. but it just mapped really well with me wanting to talk about the reenchantment that you've been bringing up about what to do about our model breaking down. So if we could, yes, do that now, talk about what is breaking down in Dante's world comparatively to what's breaking down in our world.
Right. Well, so what's going on during Dante's lifetime is a
Maybe we should get some dates.
yes. Um, so let's see here. Trying to figure out how early I want to start. Um, so Dante, he lives in the 14th century. So he dies in the, well, okay, he lives in the late 13th, early 14th century, right? So he dies in the 1320s, I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, at this particular time, we're still a little bit before the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, but not that, not that long, right? It's not that long until the Italian Renaissance kind of happens. And I will say there's a good video that maybe we can link down in the doobly doo, as they say. To
Do they say that?
Some of them I think say that.
Okay.
But maybe there's a video I can send you the link. We can include the link by a very good friend of mine, Dr. Gary Cyril Jenkins, who has been on the Amentul podcast before. He's sort of one of the hosts of Doxamut, which I'll be speaking at in September.
Okay.
In Pennsylvania.
We'll make sure to plug that at the end,
yeah.
because last time I
sure.
forgot to ask for your plugs. But yes, we will.
Yes. Yeah. And he did a great video. It's actually sort of he's talking about Nietzsche, but to sort of like talk about Nietzsche, you have to back up all the way into like the Italian Renaissance. And he does a really good job of kind of deconstructing the idea that the Italian Renaissance was actually a secular movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so. His video is very good, and it challenged a lot of preconceptions that I had about the Renaissance. So I want to. So I don't want to paint like an overly easy like caricature here about the Renaissance, but just to say Dante stands on the cusp, and I think I've said this before. I think I said this in a Pajot video, or maybe it was in my conversation with you last. Dante stands on the cusp between the medieval and the modern, right? And so modernity is really birthed in, let's say, the 15th to 16th century, right in there. Obviously, you have the first or early modern thinkers, people like Occam, right, who directly contribute to the Protestant Reformation. Luther very famously said, "I am nothing if not an Occamist." Right?
Okay.
And if I had to sort of say, here's the main difference between the medieval way of thinking, which is influenced by Plato and Aristotle, and particularly it's sort of a combination of Aristotle and Christian Platonism, and then the world of modernity, right, nominalism and all this other stuff. One would be that in the medieval world, they understood things in fractals, and they understood things as being and they understood man in particular as a microcosm. In fact, I think if I was going to try to write like a primer and say this is how you understand the medieval social imaginary or the medieval worldview, number one on my list would be you have to understand that in the ancient world and in the medieval world, they understood man as a microcosm. So in other words, you contain the entire cosmos within you.
Oh, wow. That's some deep stuff.
You contain it within you, or you recapitulate it, or like you sort of stand for the whole cosmos, right? So the whole Eastern idea of redemption, the whole Eastern idea of salvation, it encompasses much more than just saving human beings from hell. And the reason for that is because they see all of the cosmos as actually sort of like gathered up together into the human person. So by saving Adam, right, this is how in the Eastern Orthodox Church, for instance, this is how our hymnography speaks about it. It always talks about saving Adam from Hades. Well, why saving Adam? Well, because he's the first man, right? So Christ is the new Adam. He recapitulates humanity. The Apostolic Fathers write about this, but also this idea of like rescuing Adam is rescuing every single human person, right? So you're rescuing Adam, and then also this idea that Adam had let's say a priestly responsibility to sort of offer creation up to God, and that it's his basic failure to do this that resulted in sin and death, and mankind being sent out into the world of sin and death. And so, and that's what Christ perfectly fulfills, right? Is that offering of everything up. But the reason it's essential that everything be offered up is because this is how God intended creation to work. So this is, I promise, like, it sounds like we're off of Dante, but I promise this is really central to Dante's.
You'll bring us back.
Okay. Yeah, I'll bring us back. So the way that some theologians speak about this is to say that the fathers and the early church, the Eastern Church, had an anthropocosmic worldview, not an anthropocentric. So in other words, not man at the center of things, but anthropocosmic. So in other words, man as cosmos, or the
okay,
cosmos
can
as
we?
a human being.
I really want to highlight this because people wrongly think, because they thought that the sun revolved around the earth, they thought that man was the center of all things. And no, actually, you have no idea what you're talking about. Even though technically that's what they thought, but they didn't think they were the center.
If you were going to apply a literal, let's say, like geometric view of the Ptolemaic model, then it doesn't actually put mankind at the center of things. It puts mankind at the bottom of things.
Okay, so because it's more of like a tower.
Right.
Okay.
Every direction you go is up, right? Every direction you go is towards God. It's towards heaven, right?
Okay.
So the farthest away you can get from God is actually the center of the earth. That's why Dante puts hell there. Mm-hmm. That's why he has like the center, and there's this wonderful moment at the end of Inferno as they're climbing up Satan's butt cheeks.
Good times.
It's in there, people. There's actually just a really surprising number of butt cheeks in the Divine Comedy, especially in Inferno. So
he just wanted to throw it in there for like the giggling schoolboys at the back. Yeah.
Well, okay. This is in the Middle Ages. You have to understand. So I heard somebody once say, Protestants are offended by indecency. Catholics are offended by blasphemy. And this is certainly true in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, like, it would be utter blasphemy to speak something unworthy of Christ or of his mother, right? But like, if you wanted to make, put a fart joke in your epic poem, as Dante does, it's not a big deal.
Open
like, nobody
field,
would have been, and like to work something like that into this work of like high theology, no one in the Middle Ages would have batted an eye at that. That's just like, that's how you do it.
Sweet. Monty Python sort of, has capitalized on such things. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and that's. I mean, there's a lot of sort of body humor in this medieval high literature. Chaucer is a good example. It's always fun working with like conservative Christian teens, and you start reading Chaucer for the first time, and
they have no idea.
So what's happening in this? And like, well, let me explain. Or here's the dirty pun embedded in the title of one of Shakespeare's plays, and now you'll never be able to unsee that. Right. Things like that.
Satan, climbing up Satan's butt cheek.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Let me climb you up Satan's butt cheek.
Yes.
Yeah. So as they're climbing up Satan's butt cheek, there's this wonderful, like, very actually sort of like scientifically realistic moment where, what I mean by this, Dante is like trying, based on his knowledge of the natural sciences, like he's trying to account for. So there's actually a moment where the gravity switches.
They're going down, but then they're going up.
Yes, exactly. Yes. They're climbing like down Satan's body, and then all of a sudden they find themselves like climbing up his legs and out into the other side of the planet, which is a wonderful moment, because people have these stupid ideas like, oh, well, they didn't know about gravity, and they didn't know the world was round, and all this different stuff. And, like Newton was the first person to notice that things fell down, something like that. Well, anyway, all that to say, the reason that Dante locates Satan there at the center of the planet is because that's the farthest point that you can fall from God. So the Ptolemaic model is not anthropocentric in the sense that it makes man the center of the universe. It makes everything about man. It's certainly not man as the measure of all things. There were people like that's a quote from a Greek philosopher. There were people who thought that way, but it's not how like the Christian medieval world thought about things.
Right.
Now that said, we do see the role that humanity has, and sort of participating in the cosmos is supposed to be a very high role. Right. So that's the flip side of this. That's why I said it's more like anthropocosmic. In other words, so Saint Maximus the Confessor, writing in the 6th century, so the 500s, it's good several centuries before Dante. Saint Maximus will write that, talking about the structure of a church, like the physical building, and what he'll say is that the church, or the temple, the physical building, has the shape of a human being, and a human being has the shape of a church. So a human being is made up of a body, which corresponds to like the narthex, or like the porch of the church, right? You can think about that as it's the part that faces outward. It's the part that most of the world interacts with, right? And it has a soul, and your soul is getting a little deeper into yourself. And soul is variously defined, but you can say it's something like your mind, your will, your emotions, right? And then he says and that corresponds to the nave, which is where most of the faithful stand during the service. And then you have a spirit, or a heart, or a nous, and that corresponds to the altar within the church. So the idea is that is where you are supposed to offer up worship to God, is like in your inmost self. And that involves your body, and it involves your soul, because like just the same way that you have to pass through those parts of the church to get to the altar, so whatever you're doing worship wise has to move through those parts of you. But the ultimate destination is that inmost part of you that becomes an altar. And of course, when St. Paul says your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, he has something similar in mind, right? So, but then what he goes on to say is he actually says, the whole universe, like the cosmos, has the shape of a church and has the shape of a human being. And so the human being is a cosmos. And then he says, and so the cosmos is a human being, and every human being is a cosmos. So that's how he puts it. So this is the most important idea of the medieval model. Okay. And
is
so
it breaking down with Dante?
Dante's not breaking it down. No.
Oh, sorry. I mean, is the concept of the anthropocosmic model, is that breaking down for Dante, or no?
Where this starts to break down in Dante's time, and a little bit after, I would say, comes in two ways. One is the rise of nominalism. Right. So nominalism is it's a philosophical belief that basically says the names that we apply to things are more or less arbitrary, that these like Platonic forms, these like interior spiritual realities to things don't really exist, and that the world that you're dealing with is like the world that you're dealing with is all there is. Right. And so Luther was, again, by his own admission, deeply influenced by this, and it's really a rejection of Platonic forms. It's also a rejection of like medieval scholasticism and so on. Okay, that's one of the things that's happening. Another thing that is happening that I don't hear people talk about so much when they talk through the history of these ideas is that there are some major political and economic shifts that happen. They begin in the life of Dante, and they really accelerate over the course of the next century and a half, leading up to the Reformation. And these shifts include things like the rise of maritime shipping, which basically allows, for instance, it eventually allows Venice to dominate. So within like 100 years after Dante's death, right, Venice becomes the world superpower, right? And basically they remain the world superpower until the discovery of the New World. Right. Okay. And the discovery of the New World scuttles that, right? But in both cases, what you have is this ability to import both. Obviously, all this is tied up in like the Fourth Crusade, and a bunch of other unpleasantness, and the rise of Islam, which whittles away pretty quickly at the Eastern Roman Empire. All this stuff is going on, and it's a little I don't want to spend a whole lot of time just like going into the back and forth tug of war between all these different powers. There are other people who could do that better than me, for one thing, but also what I'm more interested in is the impact that this has on the way that people think, right? Has the impact this has on the model, because this isn't something I've really heard people talk about so much. And that is, now, I'm very resistant to arguments that that are basically Marxist, and that they basically want to think of everything in terms of money and power, and they see money and power as the main drivers of everything in the world. On the other hand, I'm a pretty medieval thinker, and so what that means is that I believe that, among other things, what that means is that I actually believe that things like money and political power are tied to spiritual realities.
Okay.
And so when you see a shift in monetary and political power, that does tell you something about the way that spiritual realities are shifting and changing. And you can ask the question, well, which came first, the chicken or the egg? But these kinds of things, I mean, this is the picture that we get in the scriptures, right? Things like the book of Daniel, things like Revelation, where you have all these strange prophecies and like beasts, and they have all the heads and the horns and the teeth and the leopards and the, all this different stuff, right? That's those are difficult passages to read, and a lot of people kind of go squirrely trying to interpret them. But actually, Dante uses the same kind of imagery, especially in this sort of mystery play that happens at the end of Purgatorio. But the point of all of that, the point of that kind of like apocalyptic unveiling of things, is to show the spiritual reality behind these shifts in political and economic power. So in my mind, the two biggest shifts in political and economic power, which give rise to the existence of modernity in the modern age, is this massive influx of wealth, first from the East, in the form of the Venetian trade routes and Venice's rise as a sea power, and then from the New World.
Okay, I'm thinking like that materialistic sort of space.
So when the Spanish Empire, not just the Spanish Empire, but they were the most effective colonizers of that early period, right? When the Spanish Empire goes over to the New World, and they just start shipping back entire ships full of nothing but gold and silver ingots.
Right, 1492. Columbus sails the ocean blue.
Sailed the ocean blue. Yes, yes. So once that starts happening, of course, he was sailing for Portugal. But anyway, so once
was he? Oh shoot.
Well, no. Sorry, he was Portuguese and he was sailing for Spain. That's
right.
He was like a Portuguese Jew, and then he was sailing for Spain. Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
Right.
So
Ferdinand and Isabel and all them. Yeah.
Once you have this massive influx of wealth, and it's coming not through the usual channels anymore, right? So actually the normal flow of wealth in a medieval society is very slowly undulating kind of up and down. So you have people, peasants or workers or whatever like that, and they're working, and they're passing raw products up to the king. And what does the king do with that? But it goes through the whole hierarchy of society. Gets up to the king. What does the king do with it? Well, he takes that value and he literally stamps his face on it, right? He literally puts his stamp on it, right, in the form of currency, and he makes currency, and then that currency kind of flows back.
Right.
And so you can think of like a tidal motion, right?
Okay.
And that's the normal sort of economic movement within the Middle Ages, and that's intrinsically tied into the spiritual, emotional, human realities of a feudalism, of the hierarchy, of all these different things. Well, when you suddenly have this massive amount of cash that's coming in, either through Venice, which sort of, tried to go outside the normal feudal structure of things anyway, and the Italian city-states, were just a total mess during this period. So you have this constant decentralization or recentralization of power.
Sorry, why are they a mess? Can you?
Oh man.
Is it? Oh dear. Oh, okay. Oops.
We could just talk an hour about the.
Okay. So I'll just believe it. I'll take it at face value. Okay, they are a mess.
Let's say that the main. So the Italian city-states are basically like independent city-states, which are also part of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yes.
But then the big tension that's going on at this time, and it's in the background. It's not even the background of Dante. It's like there, right? Is this tension between how much? Is the tension between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, And the question of how much secular authority, how much temporal authority, that's the better word, how much temporal authority and power and wealth should the Roman Catholic Church hold in the person of the Pope versus the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So there's this very important document which Dante refers to over and over again. It is a forged document. In fact, we all know it's a forgery now, but at Dante's time, they didn't know this. There was a forged document called the Donation of Constantine, which the papacy sort of came up with in the first half of the second millennium, and they came up with this document, the Donation of Constantine, to use as leverage against the Eastern Church, but also more importantly as leverage against the Holy Roman Emperor. It's basically saying Constantine on his death basically left a will, right, in which he
was lucky.
In which he donated the Western Empire to the Pope. Okay.
Wow! So how generous of Constantine.
So, I'm just googling it to see when that decree was discovered. So it says composed probably in 8th century, but used especially in the 13th century, which is in Dante's time, by popes in claims of political authority by the papacy, right? So this is like the big question then, is so there were people actually sort of spinning out of the Franciscan movement, right? So St. Francis came along a little bit earlier than Dante. And basically he started this movement to try to get back towards poverty. And though I'm Orthodox, Francis is not a canonized saint in my church, but I have to say there are a lot of Orthodox historians who find in him a very sympathetic character, in that his emphasis on a return to what are called the evangelical councils, which sort of the basis of Christian monastic life and experience, are definitely things we're on board with. Like, that's great.
Well, and there were the Poor Clares as well that were contemporary with him.
Yes, so the Poor Clares, all of that stuff is really coming out of Francis, and there are a lot of other movements, and of course some of these movements like spun off in like problematic heretical directions. Others, like Francis, were able to submit themselves to the church's hierarchy. So all of this is going on, right? So the thing to know about Dante is that he was probably what today we would call a third order, a secular Franciscan. He seems to have been a member of the Franciscan order, but like a lay member essentially.
Oh, interesting! I didn't know
that. He hadn't like committed the whole way. He hadn't gone the whole hog on this stuff, but he was like a little more like he was definitely. I mean, he definitely leans in that direction. There's no doubt from his poem that he leans in that direction. So here's the thing. Francis and the people who kind of came after him, they're not communist or something like or socialist. Like they don't believe nobody should have the wealth and power. They believe the Holy Roman Emperor should have the wealth and the power, and that the church should be essentially poor.
Okay. So there's like a separation of church and state, kind of.
Okay. All right. So here's the interesting direction that this goes. Okay, is that what ends up happening 2 or 3 generations after Francis is that you have the Franciscan order basically backing the Holy Roman Empire against the papacy, and it's these guys, the Franciscans, who start rejecting scholasticism. So William of Ockham, Francis Bacon, right? These guys, they're all involved with the Franciscan order.
And why are they against scholasticism?
Well, oh man. So we start getting into. I'm
so sorry. No, I can't help it, Richard.
It's okay. There are. there are so many, like, there's so many good things out there to read on this, and it's all very complicated stuff. I can't remember if Occam was a Franciscan or no, he was a Franciscan friar. That's right. Um, and so essentially, no, that's too simplified. Okay. I'm sorry.
Like, was gonna go here, but nah.
You asked me a question that in my head I felt like I know the answer to, but then like when you asked me, I'm like, well, I don't think I can explain that easily, which means that by Winston Churchill's definition, I don't really know the answer. Let me yeah. So let me try to put it this way.
Okay.
Scholasticism is very much tied up with the papacy and with the church hierarchy and with this old way of doing things.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Which comes to so already in Dante's time, there was this perceived tension between the Dominican order, which Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, and the Dominicans is the order of preachers. They take the name of Saint Dominic, but of course the joke was, in Latin, Dominicanus would be like the dogs of God, right? So they were like, God's dogs, like these aggressive preachers. They're out there, they're evangelizing, they're doing, they're hunting heretics, and they're trying to expand the church's power and like centralized authority. And then over here you have the Franciscans. The Franciscans are like, they're the poor, preachers. They're trying to like, teach people to love Lady Poverty and stuff like this. So there was this contest, or sort of not contest. There was this rivalry between the orders, real or perceived. In Dante's own time, that only intensified after his death. In fact, one of the things that Dante very skillfully does is when you get to Paradiso, when you get to paradise and you get up into heaven, he has Saint Dominic praise the Franciscan order, and then he has Saint Francis praise the Dominican order, and then he has each one of those saints decry the excesses and abuses of their own order, right? So it's his way of trying to help sort of like mend that fence, but also like respond to some of the extremism that was already there in his own time. Okay. So what this ends up doing is that the Franciscans, who are trying to back the power of the temporal power of the secular authority, right? That's where modernism comes from.
Okay. So is that why? So I'm just thinking about how you were saying that Dante is a sort of third order friar, not friar, but part of the Franciscans.
What today is called a secular Franciscan. In other words, so he's a lay person, but he's like living, probably lived for some amount of his life.
Okay, so him being this, is that partially the anti-scholasticism thing? Why he wrote to the lay people?
But here's the thing: he's not anti-scholastic at all. In fact, Dante is the best.
But he didn't write in Latin. Like that's my point.
Yeah. So he didn't write in Latin, but he's not anti-scholastic. He loves Aquinas. In fact, here's the thing: Dante's Divine Comedy is. I'm not a Thomist, but I used to be, and Dante's Divine Comedy is the best case for Thomism that exists.
Can you remind me what Thomism is?
So Thomism is like
it's like Thomas Aquinas?
The philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The Divine Comedy is the best case for Thomism that exists. In fact, I tell people, if you want to know what Thomism is really about, don't read the Summa, because it'll, because unless you're the sort of person who appreciates the way that medieval scholastic theologians wrote, you will probably just come away with the idea that this is dry and boring and not at all lively and a living system at all. Okay. So don't read the Summa. Unless you're a certain kind of person, I would say don't start with the Summa. Read the Divine Comedy 3 or 4 times, and you will know, if you do that, you'll have a much better idea of what Thomas has to say about will, about desire, about choice, about our appetitive and incentive powers, about hell, about God, about hierarchy, about the Mother of God, all this different stuff. Like if you read if you read the comedy 3 or 4 times, like you'll get there. So the thing is, like, when I say, there's this sort of diversion happening, right, that had started in Dante's lifetime. But I'm not saying Dante is himself culpable in that. In fact, what I think Dante does the best, and this is why I sent you that article, what Dante does a really good job of doing, in my opinion, is showing us a way forward when the model that we're in starts to collapse. So to kind of break
and that's what I picked up on. So.
Right. All the way back around, right? Okay. So the medieval model starts collapsing sometime not too long after Dante's death. Okay. Things were already fragmenting in Italy, in his lifetime, but the model definitely starts kind of falling apart sometime before his death, right? Well, so the model falls apart sometime after his death, and there's all these different things that are involved, right? The sighting of the first supernova, which was a really disruptive thing, right? Because it meant that there was change in the heavens, which actually broke a lot of the Ptolemaic models' predictive powers, let's say, although it still works most of the time, right? But the sighting of the first supernova that Western Europeans could remember, the economic shifts that I was talking about a moment ago, where one way to think about that is you've got value that's not coming from a centralized place, but rather you've got this chaotic value that's coming from the outside. It's coming in from the margins, right? So the margins have always been like a place of potential, of chaotic potential, of spice, of wealth. If you watched some of our recent videos,
I did. I've been catching up, coming up to this.
Talking about Ethiopia, right? So those videos have that in there. But when you get too much of that, like you can just think about like what would happen to your recipe, right? If you're if you looked at the spice requirement, which was this much pepper, and you said instead, I'm going to dump an entire bucket of pepper into my meal, right?
Oh, well, when you use salt accidentally instead of sugar?
Yes. When you use salt instead of sugar, or but except that when we're talking about the medieval economy, it's using tens of thousands of times more than the prescribed amount.
Right.
Well, what's going to happen to your recipe? Your recipe is not prepared to deal with that, right? That's, your meal is gonna bomb. It's gonna fall apart, right? So you've got all that going on. What Dante does, though, is that Dante takes the primary feature of the medieval model, which I was talking about a moment ago, which is not just medieval, but it's also the primary model feature of the ancient way of thinking, which is man as a microcosm. And what he does is he shows us a way to carry that forward into a changing world and a changing era.
Okay. How?
So, when you read the Divine Comedy is, he's being shown hell. Why is he being shown hell? Dante's lost his way. He's having, at the midpoint of his life, so he's about 30 something, 30, which, yeah.
What? What is this, sir?
Yeah, 30, it's just, it's time for a midlife crisis. And he says he's lost his way. He finds himself in a dark wood of error, is what he says. It's a dark wood of error. And then he says, and I knew not how I got here. Or knew not how I got, right? So, in other words, Dante is one of these people who, if you read his biography, he's gotten massively involved in the political. I mean, at one point, he was like one of the 6 rulers of the city of Florence, right? And that promptly led to him getting on the wrong side of the Pope and the wrong side of the political movements that were attached to the Pope versus the ones that were attached to the Holy Roman Emperor. And he gets exiled from the city, tried and condemned to death in absentia, and he spends the rest of his life living and eventually dies in exile, right? So he's gone through very difficult, let's say, political circumstances, which have corresponded with a a sort of a moral decay or a moral fall, one which the city of Florence was experiencing largely, but Dante was also experiencing personally. This goes back to man as a microcosm, right? You have a whole city in you, you have the whole world kind of in you. So when Dante begins his Commedia, which is what he called it, the divine got tacked on later. When he begins his Commedia, he says that Commedia is a comedy in just ancient Greek dramatic terms. A comedy is a story that begins badly and ends happily. That's what a comedy is, as opposed to a tragedy, which is a fall. It's a story that begins happily and ends sadly. Right? Okay, so he begins his Commedia by saying he's found himself in a dark wood of error, and he doesn't know how he got there. Right? So he's one of these people who, like, one day, and that's the thing, like, we always want to say, even with these, when we're talking about like these like civilizations rising and falling and models rising and breaking down, like, it's really tempting, and I've probably done it a bunch. Part of the reason it's so hard for me to talk about this period is because the more you study it, the more you realize there's not really like one person or one moment that you can really point to and say, this is when the switch was flipped, right? This is when we went from being the medieval world to the modern world, right? It's just,
it's
even things like
burn almost.
Yeah. And sometimes it's like a useful, heuristic to like pick a date or pick a person, or like say, oh, well, the great schism between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church happened in 1054. Well, anybody who's studied the subject knows that is a date which is both too early and too late. But it's convenient to use in a conversation, right? Okay, so it's really tempting to sort of like look back at these periods, or to look back at our own lives and be like, well, and this is the moment where everything changed. This is the moment where everything went wrong. But really, we are we're kind of a sum total of just all of these little decisions that were made, these little drifts, these little, that were made along the way. And that's the situation Dante finds himself in. And he does what many of us have probably done, which is to wake up at some point in our life, lost in our sin, lost in our addiction, lost in whatever, and say, I don't even recognize myself anymore. How did I get to be here? Dante was at one point, as a younger man, so of course you probably know in the poem Beatrice is a big deal. She died, in her early 20s. And so Dante was younger than her. So he was quite young when she died. But there was one point in their, they only met probably, I forget the exact number of times, but probably only met in person like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
But Dante was at one point as a young man living such a profligate life in Florence that Beatrice refused to even acknowledge him when they passed in the street. Like, because she was just so embarrassed and horrified by what he'd become. And that was some time before, he gets exiled. So he's just one of these people, he, like many of us often probably do, like he wakes up and he realizes he doesn't know how he got to be where he is. And he sees, here's the problem with Florence, right? But the problem with Florence is really the problem with Dante, right? When Dante goes down to hell, it's a very personal hell. Almost everyone Dante meets in hell is somebody he knows, or it's somebody that he's familiar with from a book he's read. He doesn't meet random people that he's never heard, right? He doesn't meet Joe from Spokane, and he meets a lot of people that he knows, and for the most part, I'd say probably a good third, maybe more, of the people that he meets in hell and purgatory and paradise are people from Florence, or people who have some kind of involvement in the political scene of the time. This is what makes the poem very difficult for new readers, because they don't know who any of these people are, and you have all these political parties that keep getting alluded to. There's the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, but then there's like the black Guelphs and the white Guelphs, and what the heck is a Guelph? Is that from the Dark Crystal? Like, what's going on?
What is a Guelph? Yeah.
So this is one of the more difficult things about the poem. But the reason that everyone Dante meets is somebody that he knows is because this is the journey of Dante's soul, right? Dante contains within himself hell.
Mm.
because what is he doing in hell? He's learning about how sin works. He's learning about why do people sin. And really, when you're asking the question, why do people sin? The question you're really asking is, why do you sin? Why do the people that I know sin, right? Whenever someone asks, well, if God is really good, then why do, bad things happen to good people? But what they really mean by that is like,
Why
why
do
do
bad
bad
things
things
happen to
happen to
me?
me or by somebody I know and care, or to somebody that I know and care about, right? When Dante passes through purgatory, right? So, you could say very broadly something like Dante is learning about sin and why people sin, and more specifically, he's learning how to have an appropriate response to sin. And that's what's happening in Inferno. So in Inferno, there are these moments where Dante meets these people who Dante, who's a very careful poet, purposely portrays as being kind of sympathetic, right? You're actually supposed to empathize with them a little bit, especially when he gets to the early on in the poem, when he gets to the region of hell, which is reserved for adulterous lovers. And he meets people and just starts asking the stories of like, well, why did you do this thing that you did? And it's the kind of stories that teenagers would tell about their own little, love affairs. It's kind of stories that we would tell today about why did so and so leave his wife? Well, if you asked him, he probably wouldn't try to make himself come across as a monster who just can't keep it in his pants, right? It'd be like, well, kind of fell out of love with this person and I fell in love with this other person. And like we really try to make ourselves sort of excusable, to make ourselves plausible. Dante does this for the people.
Okay.
And then Dante as the character, right? So you got Dante, the poet, and then Dante as the character weeps and swoons and feels just terrible for these people. And Virgil basically hits him with a stick. Doesn't actually hit him with a stick, but he basically says, listen, if you think what you're experiencing right now is pity, you don't know what pity is. So pity is an important theme for Virgil. In Virgil's poem, the Aeneid, okay, pietas, which could be translated like piety, but also as pity, is the main character, it's the main virtue which Aeneas, his hero, possesses. He's often, in English translations, it's referred to constantly as pious Aeneas. The reason that Aeneas has piety or pity, right? So Aeneas spends half the poem weeping. He's the sort of person who weeps at the drop of a hat. But the things that he weeps about are things that a hero should weep about. The reason that he has piety is because he orients himself properly to the gods and to his parents, right? So one important aspect of piety in Roman thinking is the way that you treat your parents, especially your father. So one of the things that he does is to have a proper funeral celebration for his father, right? And it takes up a huge section of the poem. And if you're not into like old, ancient Roman funerary, practices, it can be a really one of these passages people kind of get bogged down in.
Kind of drag, yep.
The reason it's so important is because you've got to show that he's doing the right thing by his father, right? That he's so that's piety. So when Virgil, the character, right, who that's the main theme of his poem, right, when he's talking to Dante and he says, if you think this is pity, then you don't really understand God, you don't really understand justice, and you don't really understand love. Dante is not supposed to feel sorry for anyone in hell. This is hard, right? This is hard, and this is one of the things that when we read the poem for the first time as modern people, because we don't, if you believe that hell is a real place, you don't want someone to go there.
No.
But what Dante, the poet, is at pains to show us is that this hell is really Dante's own hell. That the people in this hell are actually people who have stopped being people. They're people who have chosen to identify so strongly with their sins that their punishment is actually just to become an embodiment. So this is like, there are all these sort of like let the punishment fit the crime kind of things going on. But the reason that is done that way is because the poet is at pains to show us that every single person that is in Dante's hell as Lewis said, it's locked from the inside. In other words, every single person that's there, they weren't locked away there by God, but rather they chose so strongly to identify with their sin that in the end, that's what they became, right? That basically everybody in the end, in Dante's universe, it's the most fair version of the universe, because in Dante's cosmos, everyone gets what they want in the end. So if in the end of your life, if the thing that you really want the most is your lust, your sin, your addiction, all these things, then you identify with them to the point that you slowly begin to stop being a human being.
Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Yeah,
Really.
exactly. Yeah. And so then so now that Dante has that corrected view of sin, so actually finally he gets to this point where when he reaches the circle of hell reserved for the Simoniac popes. So simony is the selling of the church's sacraments for money. This would include
indulgences?
Well, no, not so much.
No, sacraments.
This would
sacraments?
Be more like sacraments, in particular the sacrament of ordination usually. So this would be where somebody's like, you go to somebody like, hey, I need to appoint a new bishop. If you'll drop 30 grand into my bank account, I can make sure that you're that guy, right?
Okay.
This is a huge problem in the Roman Catholic Church in Dante's time. It was a major way that the popes consolidated their wealth and their power. And Dante has a whole ring of hell dedicated just to popes who did this stuff. So like, Dante is, as faithful a Roman Catholic as you could possibly wish in this poem, but he is not at all shy of putting popes in hell, right? Because, and he's not at all shy at excoriating the current occupant of the papal curia.
Who was Pope then? Was it Innocent the Third? I know he was a big powerhouse.
No, I think this is
after him?
Yeah, this is at one point it's one of the Bonifaces, but there are actually 2 or 3 popes who were popes during Dante's lifetime. And if I was a better Dante scholar, I could tell you off the top of my head.
Well, I sprung it on you.
Yeah, it's okay. It's one of those things I would have to go look up.
Right.
But Dante is not at all shy. I think it's I want to say it's like Boniface the 14th, but I think that's wrong.
Okay.
But anyway, he's not at all shy about putting popes in hell and like criticizing the current pope, right? Who he sees as having completely abrogated the authority that was given to him. Like they completely abused it, right? And so there's one of the most excoriating passages in the whole Commedia comes in Paradise when Dante meets St. Peter, and St. Peter goes off on the whole lineage of current popes. Just really
have it.
rips him a new one. Yeah. Okay, so Dante, and when he gets there, that's the first time that in the Inferno that I can remember that Dante is really able to just really tear into the people in hell and just like really be like, you should be suffering this way. This is a very fitting punishment because of the way that you have destroyed the Church of God. And Virgil praises him. He says, good, you're finally getting it. You're finally starting to understand. Right? Because this isn't just about, Dante's not writing like a here's a handy guide to the dogmatic teachings of the Roman Catholic Church on the afterlife. It's not what the comedy is at all, right? This is Dante learning to deal with his own sin. So when he gets to Purgatorio, again, everyone he meets in Purgatorio is also dealing with those same sins. What's the difference? Everyone in Purgatory is saved. This is really important to remember. Everyone in Purgatory is saved. In fact, Dante's vision of Purgatory is significantly nicer than most medieval accounts of Purgatory, which are frankly obscene and horrifying a lot of the time. Like there's like, gosh, if Purgatory is like that, please.
What is hell?
Yeah, I want to know what hell is, you know. And that was probably the point of those accounts, is to like really scare people. But so Dante's view of purgatory is this sort of tiered mountain, which seems to be an image which is, if it's not totally original to him, like it's pretty much his own. But he makes it into the mountain of paradise, right? So at the top of the mountain of purgatory is the Garden of Eden. So this is a really important detail. And by the way, the sort of gatekeeper to the mountain of purgatory is Cato, who is a pagan Roman who committed suicide. The wonderful thing about Dante is that if you think oh, okay, I've totally mapped out your whole scheme now, Dante, and you encounter Cato at the base of the mountain of purgatory, it's like, well, okay, I guess I don't really understand this as well as I thought I did.
Why? Okay.
It's a different discussion. It's okay. Yeah. It's okay. It's a different discussion. It's really interesting though. I have 2 or 3 theories.
Okay. Great. You're gonna leave me. Leave him wanting.
It's okay. Yeah. So as he ascends the mountain of purgatory, Dante encounters all of these same sins again. And but now what he's doing is he's encountering people who are being purified by them. And so what ends up happening is that at each level of purgatory, Dante is he's confronted with an example of the sin, usually from it's basically a carrot and a stick approach, right? So he's given an example of, here's someone who embodied the sin to their destruction, and then here's someone who was able to overcome the sin by possessing the necessary virtue to defeat it, to overcome it. For example, and the person that possesses the necessary virtue is always the Virgin Mary. So there's this idea, this goes back to like Bernard of Clairvaux, or at least a work attributed to him. People sort of debate about whether or not he wrote it, in which, but it's definitely a work which seemed to have influenced Dante pretty dramatically. And in this work, the work focuses on the person of the Blessed Virgin. It's basically an extended gloss on what the Archangel Gabriel says to her when he says to her that she is full of grace. I think the KJV translates that as something like, hail, oh highly favored one, right? But to have the favor of the gods on you in Greek is to be given charisma, right? In other words, anointing, right? So to be full of the graces, right? Charis is the Greek word for grace, right? But it's related to like our word for chrism, anointing, things like this, right? So, so the idea was that because Mary has this fullness of grace, that she has the totality of the virtues perfectly manifested within herself. And so at each level of purgatory, for instance, at the level of pride, there are these really beautiful, hyper realistic carvings, sort of like bas relief kind of carvings there on the, when he reaches the ring of pride, which is the first ring in his purgatory. And we could talk about why does he situate pride in one place in purgatory and actually in a different place in hell. And that's, like if you're reading the comedy for the first time, what you should do is like for your first read through, just try to pay attention to where he situates various sins and virtues and think about what's he saying about the hierarchy of those sins and virtues. But so the exemplar, right, the sort of the carrot, this is the thing that you're supposed to be, right, is this image of the Mother of God, as she's got her head bowed and she says to the Archangel Gabriel, "Behold the handmaiden of the Lord, be it unto me as you will," right? And so this is a moment of supreme and perfect humility, which is the virtue which you need to overcome the sin of pride. My favorite one is probably on the when he comes to the circle of avarice, avarice or greed. The virtue that you need to overcome this, I think I'm remembering this correctly. Again, I taught through the comedy maybe like a year and a half ago, and I'm about to start reading through it again actually this September. So I'm kind of going off
Good primer.
so I'm kind of going off of some memory here. So, but to overcome avarice or greed, the corresponding virtue that you need is charity, right?
Of course.
Charity, which is like a desire for. Nowadays, we say charity to mean like charitable giving, but it means just a whole lot more than that in the medieval sense, right? But here's the moment that it uses for the mother, an example of the Mother of God's charity, her generosity, her concern for other people. It's when she tells.
This is the wedding at Cana. Oh,
at Cana, yes, and when she tells him they have no wine. And, this might seem like a weird example at first, right? Because it's just that one line that's quoted. This might seem like a weird example of like generosity or charity. But you think about like if we are at a party and we're there and there's some kind of like major failure on the part of the people hosting the party, aren't we tempted to just maybe laugh a little bit and be like, oh man, you guys didn't even plan the wine right, or something like that, or at least to think, well, if I had been planning this party, I would have had, and so like we want to be like a little smug, and we want to be like a little judgmental and or whatever, and like have just like a quiet laugh at somebody else's expense. And the vision, the picture of the Mother of God that St. John gives us in his gospel is that she's so full of care and concern for the people around her that she cannot stand the thought that somebody would be even minorly embarrassed. So much so that she is willing to bring in divine intervention to fix that problem. I mean, what a strange first miracle.
I've always thought that.
So, I mean, it's a very strange first miracle, and but it sort of it comes into being because of this blossoming of Dante, of the Mother of God's, her charity, her love, her selflessness. Just not being willing to even see somebody embarrassed, let alone suffer or go without. So I really love Purgatory. It's probably actually sort of my favorite book. Most people stop. I would say probably 299 out of 300 people who read the comedy stop at the end of Inferno, because most people are made to read Inferno for high school and then not made to continue. And that's a huge problem, because it's only the first. Basically, getting to the end of Inferno is just trying to figure out what's the problem.
Right.
What's
you
the
gotta
problem?
finish.
Then, like, you
gotta get to the comedy part.
So in Purgatorio, and I know we're going kind of long here, so maybe we can wrap up on this thought. But in Purgatorio, right at the beginning, as he gets up the mountain of Purgatory, and there's actually a whole lot of stuff that happens as he's trying to get up the mountain. But once he gets up to the mountain of Purgatory, and he actually gets to enter, one of the things that happens is that he has 7 P's for Latin peccatum, sin, right? Engraved, actually cut into his forehead.
Oh.
And then as he moves up each one of the levels, there's an angel guarding the entrance to the next level. And as he moves past these angels, there's this one moment where there's just like this brush of an angel's wing against his forehead, and one of the P's just falls off. So when Dante is going through Purgatory, what he's doing is he's encountering different people who are being purged of the sin that characterized them in life. Right? So if you choose to identify with sin, you become your sin. But if you choose to if you choose to if you can choose to even start the path to repentance, this is what Dante's showing. It's like if you even begin, you take the first step. Doesn't mean you've beaten the sin, but if you can choose to even start the path to repentance, then you have this capacity, this possibility that opens up of actually recovering your humanity, so that in the end, sin becomes such a slight, small, insignificant thing that it can be brushed aside by the touch of an angel's wing, right?
Right.
So all of this is just to get up to Paradiso. And
Yes, I know. And I'm
Paradise
like, oh, we're running out of time, and I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you for the application part in our modern era. Is there? Can we? I feel strange not going through
No, it's okay.
Paradisia.
We're not good enough people to talk about it anyway. It's
Okay,
fine.
that's okay. Good.
Yeah,
So we
fine.
can only aspire at the moment on Earth. I did think that Purgatorio sounded in the article that you sent me. It sounds like where we are now. It does sound like that. Even like on Earth, it might not be the same, but it feels.
It's definitely the part of the comedy that most closely corresponds to, let's say, like the Christian life as you're living out from day to day.
Right.
Inferno is all night. Paradiso is all day. But Purgatory has night and day. It has both of them.
Right.
It has these moments of ascent, these moments where you have to just stop and rest.
It is an in between, a middle.
Yeah.
Middle
sort of
Earth,
middle.
Sort of.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Dante is middle-aged himself. Right? Now, it's just our own hubris that causes us to call this particular 1,000+ year period of human history the Middle Ages, as though we know roughly when our old age is going to be. Like, we might be living in the Middle Ages right now. We might still be like in the infancy of humanity. Like, no, we don't know, right? But it's definitely does occupy, let's say, a middle place between the ancient world, the world before Christ, and then the world that we live in today. So you wanted to ask about application.
Yes. Okay. So, what did I want to? Sorry. What did I say I wanted? I did have a thing to go. What did
you had like
say?
Applicability to like the?
I do. Oh yeah. Yes. Okay. So, from what you're saying, it sounds like we're trying to be made human, and losing the models is us. Maybe does that have to do with us losing part of our being human? Is that, am I really reaching there?
So
I want to bring up transhumanism, like transhumanizing, because that's what the fellow in the article wrote about.
So go back to what I said about things that were happening when the medieval model started to collapse, right? You have this huge influx of chaos potential from the outside that manifests itself in both political and economic ways, right? It results in like the reshuffling of temporal power, right? Which basically means that the power that was kind of upholding the old way of doing things, the old assumption of the world, that starts to be undermined, eroded, and eventually collapses, right? What Dante shows us, though, is that the medieval model, because it still has this idea of man as microcosm, can survive that. In other words, and if this wasn't true, we wouldn't have kept reading Dante into the modern era, right? We keep reading it at the end of the day, ultimately, because it's just deeply true. And because it actually does help us confront our own, I mean, I want to say this is like Macarius, who's an Egyptian ascetic saint, said this. It was something to the effect of like, in the human heart are demons and dragons and hell, but also God is there. The saints are there. The entire cosmos is there. Right? And so the thing that Dante shows us how to do is to actually go into our hearts, to pass through the hell that is there, to pass through the purification that can be achieved there, so that we can ultimately come to the vision and the contemplation of God, who is there. And this works no matter when you live. And I really want to emphasize this, because we can definitely that language of model that Lewis talks about in The Discarded Image is so temptingly useful that we can put too much weight on it. Right. And so we've been doing this, in our conversation. We're like, well, there's the medieval model, and then there's the modern model, and that seems like it's collapsing. And what's going to be the new model that replaces it? On one hand, that's a really interesting question to ask. On the other hand, it doesn't so much matter. Like
Okay.
on the other hand, we can watch it. We can watch it carefully because we need to be watchful and careful over our own hearts and our lives. Like where the rubber hits the road is for people like you and me who have small children,
Mm.
and we're having to make decisions about. We're having to make decisions about. Well, what are they gonna like? What TV do I let them watch?
Mm.
What school do I send them to? All this different stuff. That's where we really have to start being really careful and attentive, right? But
Mm.
when you're asking the question, like, well, what's the new model going to be, right? Most people will never know in a self-conscious way what model they find themselves in.
Okay.
Like, whatever the new model is, we're probably already in it.
Really?
And in 100 years or 1,000 years or whatever it is, people are going to be like deconstructing this really weird period where like, oh man, it sure seems like everything fell apart in the early 2000s. Let's try and figure out why, right? And they'll come up with names for it and all this different stuff, right? What Dante shows us, though, is that the things that are essentially true about the medieval model, and when I say essentially true, I mean true beyond the level of, is this going to help me predict a solstice, or is this going to help me power a city or whatever? Like, not those things are not useful things or not a kind of truth in and of themselves, but the things that are like really eternally true about the medieval model are things that you can carry forward and you can still do. But the key thing is that it requires us to sort of wake up and find that we are, in fact, lost amid a dark wood of error. And now that we're in that situation, we need a guide. Well, who does Dante look to for a guide? He doesn't look to any of his contemporaries. He doesn't have one of his buddies from school or the greatest theologian of his own time or whatever. That's not the person who comes to guide him. The person who comes to guide him out of his dark wood of error, and who is his guide for a full 2/3 of the poem, is Virgil. Which in Dante's world,
pagan
the greatest
poet.
pagan poet. Virgil belonged to the old order. He belonged to the old model, right? Which had more in common. Which had more in common with the Middle Ages than our own day and age does in some respects, not in all. But the thing you have to remember is that there's more time between Dante and Virgil than there is between Dante and us.
Oh, interesting. Yes, of course.
So if we were going to do the most medieval thing possible and wake up one day and say, well, we're lost in a dark wood of error, where do we go to for guidance? How do we get out of this? I think you could do a whole lot worse than Dante as a guide.
I was thinking that's our...
Yeah.
I can just see the movie now. No, I'm just kidding. You're like, no, you ruined it, Andrea.
Some things don't need to be a movie. Some things don't need to be a movie. So anyway, that's kind of my pitch. I basically think that so the I forget the name of that article I sent you, but it's something like Dante's, what is it, like fractal consciousness, self, something like that, right? So that jumped out at me, and I read it, and the reason that I read it was specifically because it expressed very well this reality that Dante is going for him, and that allows Dante to extend his reach beyond the model that he finds himself living in.
It's beyond, right? It's beyond that.
Yeah,
it's because it's so fundamentally true.
Right. And again, like if you had to say, like, here's the one thing that you need to like switch in your thinking to start trying to see the world in this way, it's that idea of man as a microcosm. Right. That the entire experience of the cosmos is to some extent recapitulated within myself, or it's to some extent like it all exists within myself, right? Like this is why people think, oh, people became monks because they just wanted to get away from all the temptation, and but like if you actually read ascetic literature, of which I've read, I would say probably more than the average person,
I would say that as well.
About that at all. Like every single one of them. And they're like, why am I doing this? So that I can go and fight demons more intensely. Like, I just want to get rid of all this other stuff so that I can engage in like one-on-one intensive spiritual warfare, right? Because like you carry all those things around with you, right? But it's not just that the demons are there. Like, you don't have to convince almost anyone that, you know, in the world around us today, that the demons are there, either figuratively or in some cases literally. But Christ is there. His angels are there. His saints are there. His most pure mother is there, right? When Dante wants to express, not just in Purgatorio, but in Paradiso, or for that matter, why did Virgil come and help Dante to begin with? It's because 3 important women whom Dante saw as basically his heavenly patrons saw the error that he was lost in and intervened on his behalf. And those 3 women are very important to understanding Dante's sort of whole theological program. One of them, by the way, is a saint who's very important to my family. And this is Saint Lucy of Syracuse. And if you've ever seen like pictures of like girls in Sweden with the braided hair and the candles in it, it's that Saint Lucy.
Oh, Santa Lucia.
Yeah, Santa Lucia.
Oh, I dressed up as her in grade 2 at grade 2
Yeah. So, among other things, she is the patron saint of poets and blind people. And as you read through the comedy, one of the dominant themes, I would say it's almost the dominant theme of the entire comedy, is that Dante is blind. He's blind in his error. He's blind in his sin. And that his eyes, even when he gets to paradise, the reason he can't skip straight to the top and he has to sort of move up through these different ranks of saints and angels and meet these different people is because his vision has to be strengthened so he can finally look upon God. So the whole process is one of illumination. It's one of strengthening his eyesight, strengthening the eyes of his heart so that he can finally enter into that contemplation of the Holy Trinity. So that's really what it's all about. And you can do that just as well today as you could in Dante's time. And I 100% believe, I mean, you will probably not run into very many people who will pine more than I do for the olden days, you know. But the truth is, like, if you could give me an option and say, would you like to jump in a time machine and go back and live in the 12th century? I would say no. And it's not because I'm afraid of living in a world without indoor plumbing or whatever, but it's because there is no sin that moving to the 12th century would get me away from. That, you know, there's no virtue that moving to the 12th century would help me to acquire, right? That I can't do right here and right now, because the church is still here, Christ is still here, our hearts still have this capacity, right? And so when I look back to these times, these days, these works of literature, it's not out of like a nostalgic desire to, like, you know, change what's happened in history, but it's because the things that were true then are still true now. And I think that Dante, better than anyone else writing in the Middle Ages, Dante shows us how to take that model and just carry it forward. So there's my pitch for Dante.
Oh, that was a wonderful pitch. It was a wonderful pitch that lasted the amount of my podcast.
There you go.
And we have a few minutes to spare. So you can also give me your things coming up.
Yes. Okay. So if you're in the Pennsylvania area in the month of September, when is it? I have to pull it up in my email here.
Is this Doxamoot?
Yeah, we had a Doxamoot online earlier this year, but we're doing a live event in Emmaus. Looks like it's going to be it's sometime in September. We'll put a link down in the doobly-doo, as they say.
As they say.
Yeah. So we have that's coming up in September 10th through 12th. There we go.
Okay.
I've just remembered. All right, so September 10th through 12th, we've got Doxamut online, or live. So if you're in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, during those 3 days, come and hang out with me. I'm going to be giving some talks, but I also just have some really, really fun stuff planned. So come to that. In October, I think this is the third weekend in October at Wichita, 8th Day Books, the 8th Day Institute in Wichita, Kansas. I'll be there for their Inklings Oktoberfest. I'll be giving 2 talks on the Holy Grail. Ooh. And also like a walking tour of a bunch of breweries and all kinds of fun stuff. So it's going to be really, really cool. So come to that. And then I'm also trying to put together a book of essays that'll be published next year on reenchantment and the sacramental imagination.
Okay, well, we'll talk Tolkien then.
We'll talk Tolkien then. So but I'm looking for people to contribute essays to that collection. Submissions are open until the end of the year. So the end of 2021. So you can go to findingthegoldenkey.com. And
the Golden Key. I have to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I missed you talking about it. You talked about it on Doxamut, right? The latest one. Yeah, and I heard you mention that you were going to be talking about it, and then I listened to that podcast and it was too late. And I was like, I missed it, and I still am confused by the Golden Key. So if anyone has any essays for it, please submit them.
Right. So please submit to that, and I think that's all the things that I'm doing right now. Okay. I've got some.
Just those few.
I've got
many
some
things.
Other things that are in the works, but I can't talk about them yet. So
okay.
So but anyway, just watch some space. I would say watch this space, everyone. Andrew
yes.
We'll have the scoop.
I'll update it all. Yeah, but also watch the space of the Amen Sul podcast as well, because that is. Yes. I mean, technically, that's another thing you do. So.
Yeah, that's the kind of the main place where I'm constantly doing stuff, and I have been doing some videos with Jonathan Peugeot as well.
Yes, which are fantastic. Everyone watch them.
A whole lot of fun. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much for coming on and fitting me in.
Thanks for having me.
If you would subscribe, that would be the bee's knees.